E piki mai e taku manu. Hoki mai e taku manu. Ki te whae au ki te o marama. Ti he Maori ora. E hana mai ki te whakapapa o te rā. E tautoko mai me koutou. Me he te hona rei ki te whare. Ke te whare, me ana kōrero, e tika i tēnei kaupapa. Hoki mai te wairu, hoki mai te tinana, te hinengaro, o tēnei kaupapa o te rā. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Hara mai, ki te rangatira tuene. Hara mai ki te tautoko, e tēnei rangatira. E hoa e te rangatira. Tēnā koe e te kaupapa e hara mai ki te rangatira. E mihi mai tātou i tēnei wakato. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Kia ora mai tātou katoa. E karakia mai tātou, e tū e te karakia. Can everyone stand? E tō mātou matua i tarangi. Kia tapa tō ingmau, kia tā mai te rangatiratanga. Kia me te tau e pai ai ke ranga ki te whenua. Kia ari te ano e tō tarangi. Ho mai kia mātou e rāene e taramo mātou mo tēnei ira. E muru o mātou hara, me mātou ki te hunga hara kia mātou. Ahua hoki mātou ki te hareki, ko i o tō mātou hareki. Homi e, hui e, tāi e. E noho. Kia ora mai tātou. Kia ora rangatira e tēnā. E mi mai tātou e te kaupapa te rā. E tika ana kōrero e Ngāti Whātua tērā. E tautoko mai i tēnā kaupapa. E hota rangatira e te. Tēnā koe e te hawhi mai koutou. Tēnā koe e koutou mā. Ki te mihi mai tātou i tēnei wakato. Welcome everybody to this auspicious occasion. Auspicious in the fact we're celebrating one of our greatest, if not the greatest, writer of tikanga Māori and tikanga history in our country. I'll say that, and I'm good at dodging. But the elegance and the elegance of what she has given our communities over the years must not go unnoticed. So tonight, and this group of people who come with their hearts open to listen and hear your achievements, this is an honour for Ngāti Whātua te tautoko this occasion. And I share that honour with everyone in this room. So on your behalf, I speak as a mana kōrero for our iwi and our iwi katoa. And just to reflect our relationship, the other 13 iwi that are imposed around Tamaki Makaurau, I speak on all their behalf as well. So to give that support, te ao rangatira, is such a big occasion. And quite often I've thought, well, we should do this with a little bit of bling. We should honour our dame with a little bit of bling. And we've never had the occasion to do that. So tonight, let's give that a thought. So Dame Anne, there could be something else, there could be another cherry somewhere else we might require you to attend. And that would be fitting for your career and your integrity to the Journalist Society and academia. And I'm not always a good one to agree with academia on a lot of things. But in these occasions, we gather to respond to your contribution of telling our history and telling our stories about our tupuna, about our whenua, about taku iho, and about the awa of our land and our people. So we come together tonight, people, to celebrate this wonderful occasion, to launch this book, which we'll do later on. We've got a bit of kōrero to get through first. And that's gonna, and I think if we're going to take anything away from what Dame Anne has done for our community, this is an opportunity to ask her tonight. Nō reira te hō rangatira, e mihi mai koutou I tēnei wā, e tika ana pono, e te tika, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. E atu wai atu?
Tino pai.
Oh, kia ora wai atu.
E arora,
E whakapono, me te rangi Māori e tātou e. Kia ora mai tātou. I thought you were the choir master. Paka I te pai. Nō reira e rauranga tera, e kōrero mai ana e Dame Anne, nō reira tēnā koe, e tūratuka. Kia ora.
Ko te wai e horara, ko Waitamata, ko te marae e whakatoa nei, te whare puka puka. Ko koutou āku rangatira kua pai nei.
Kia ora.
Ki a koe, te tohunga, te rangatira o Ngāti Whātua, hone, tēnā koe. Ka nui aku mihi aroha ki a koe mō tērā mihi whakamiharo. It's just so beautiful to have Ngāti Whātua, hone, here tonight. We kind of, Sam and I had decided to let this book sort of slide into the water in a quiet way because I'd just been overseas and there's a lot of things going on, filming a documentary at the moment and a few things like that. But how beautiful that you've just taken the initiative and made this such a special occasion, especially in this library, in my own home community of Devonport, where Jeremy and I have lived, and Sam as well, for a very long time now and raised our kids. And since that time too, I've known Ngāti Whātua really well. When I was a young girl, the very first time I went onto a marae was in Tiki. I was 17 years old, my first year at varsity, and Ngāti Whātua were going to a school to learn how to do tukutuku, to decorate their church down in the bay, in Okahu Bay. And so I had the pleasure of spending quite a lot of time with Bill and Connie Davis and Sir Hugh Kāwharu and many members of Ngāti Whātua, both that time and then in the year after that occasion. And we became pretty good friends, and I spent a lot of time up Boot Hill and made very many close relationships. And at Māori Studies, where I'm based too, Ngāti Whātua Rangi Māori at Rawiri, met at Gilman. We're very, very closely tied to the marae up in the hill with Ngāti Whātua. So this is really fitting, hone. Ka nui ngā mihi tino aroha ki a koe mō tēnei āhuatanga. He tino pai, he tino reka, ki au nei, he honore nui, nā reira, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe Sam, tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora.
Very good. He hara I te mea no nai nei, te aroha no nā,
I'll get to speak later.
You get to speak later, okay.
E tino pai te rangatira, e te mi mai tātou. E ngā koe mai, e te iwi o Ngāti Whātara, e ngā pui nui tonu, e tautuku mai, I tēnā kaupapa whātara. So on behalf of all those iwi, thank you, Damien. And I was going to extend a welcome to a bloke called Meng Foon.
Yeah.
He's from your ancestral background down in Ngāti Parau. I said tonight might be too small. So in another time in another place, we'll ask Ngāti Parau to come here to Ngāti Whātara. So Chris and I can get up and battle with them and debate them. And tell them she belongs here. And it's so nice on this occasion to share a little bit of humility about our whakapapa. Because those people that have been written about in this book are rejoicing as well. They've been let out to extend to everyone what the feelings of a person that is dared to write about them and share with the world about what this is all about. So you talk about bigger than Texas. Well, this is it. This is a book, Rangi Tears. You know, we talk about the tangi o rangi, to put it another way. And we know instinctively what that means. So sharing this occasion with everyone is so beautiful. So thank you all very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be it's going to be a short interlude of 5 minutes. While we just have a quick break, and then we'll come back with the kaupapa. This is Maori tikanga, and this occasion deserves all the proper tikanga attitudes which we're gathered here tonight for. So while I'm standing, I'd like to bless the food and the drinks from here, so we can carry on the night and intertwine with that aspect of our night, and then we can get on 5 minutes later. We'll call everyone to attention, and then we'll get on with the kaupapa whanau. E pā whakapainga e nei kai, hei o mātou tinana, e te whangaia ki te tara o te ora, koe e te mātou āriki, ake e tonu ake, āmane. So the food is up, we'll have a 5 minute break. We were going to make it 10 minutes or quarter an hour, but that might drag into 20 minutes. So thank you everybody. Kia ora mai tātou.
Oh my goodness.
So my name's Sam Alworthy. I'm director at Auckland University Press and proud to publish Anne's marvellous book and live in this place too, and I've got to know Anne pretty well over the years, and so it's great to be here at the library, and thanks to the Devonport Library Associates for having us, and to John for our beautiful welcome here, and it's a great place to be and to talk about books. I'm going to just give a very brief introduction to Dame Anne, and then we're just going to have a little dialogue. So Anne Salmond was born out in the wilds down in Gisborne somewhere. She was a Thorpe, a powerful family of the region down there on the East Coast, and went over to America as an AFS student, I think, and it was a sort of revelatory experience for her, I think, to see her New Zealandishness overseas and to wonder what was going on back in New Zealand that she didn't know about, and went and did anthropology, ended up doing a PhD back in America after doing undergraduate in Auckland, and then and it's been through her time, I think, as a scholar and as a person, an anthropologist, so books on hui and two Maori elders who she got to know very well, and then what some people would call a historian, so books about two worlds and between worlds and about Captain Cook, Trial of the Cannibal Dog. And then some people will have noticed that over the last few years she's become also an activist, a commentator on contemporary issues in newspapers and so on. And so she's had a whole variety of intellectual lives and lives in society over that time. And I think in this book, in Te Rangi, all three parts of Dame Anne come together in this book. So you'll find in their history and an anthropology of the present, and you'll find an activist or a approach to the contemporary world that says, hey, we could do things a bit differently. And so it's an exciting book to publish, and an exciting book, I think, for Anne to write also. Now, Anne, I'm going to first actually show you the cover of the book, and one of the things you'll remember is we had a talk before the book was written in the cafe in Devonport, and we were talking about the book and how it contained multitudes, contained both the past and the present, and tell us about those images on the cover of the book and what it tells us about this thing.
Well, I think it's a very beautiful cover, and I think the designer's done an absolutely gorgeous job. And what she's done is she's taken the back cover is actually a photograph taken by my great-grandfather, James MacDonald, who was a filmmaker and photographer at the turn of last century, and he worked very closely with Sir Api Rangata and with Peter Buck, and he was involved. He was the acting director of the Dominion Museum for quite a time, and one of the things that they did is they went down the Whanganui River. There were a series of expeditions initiated really by Sir Api Rangata in order to preserve or try and recapture for posterity, for future generations, tikanga that he thought, or customs he thought might be getting lost. And so my great-grandfather was the filmmaker on those expeditions and the photographer. So there's about 6,000 photographs, and this is one of them. They're really, really beautiful. And I love this one because it's about weaving and binding. And you can see the hands there. This is a weaver on the Whanganui River. And I've written quite a bit about the Whanganui River as well in this book. The Dominion Museum expeditions, as they were called, went down the river, visited the various marae. And then some time ago, I had the privilege of, with Libby Hakaraya as a documentary filmmaker, and retracing. She had the idea of doing a documentary in which we would retrace their footsteps. And so we went down the river too with many of these photographs. This one's another one of the Whanganui River at the top. And we took a portable printer, and Libby actually copied all the photographs marae by marae, and we did what we called sheetings. We would stop at the marae, put up a sheet in the meeting house, show the images, everybody would be calling out the names of these people, and full of memories. And then we hopped in a waka. We went from Pipiriki down to Hiruharama, paddling ourselves, which was very exciting with Jeremy and my husband Jeremy and our daughter Armedia, and we had the most amazing time on the river. So then this next one is from Waitangi. So there's another chapter about the treaty in the book. So that's pretty pertinent, and it's not just about the treaty in the past, but it's also about, I had the honour of participating. The tribunal asked me to basically renew a report that Meri Penfold and Cleve Barlow and I, those two being very beautiful native speakers, had written for the Muri Whenua land claim about what the rangatira thought they were doing when they signed the treaty. And we had written a report way back then, which had got lost in the midst of time. Its timing was poor, I think, because nobody at that time wanted to know the sort of outcomes of, or the kind of findings that we had, which was essentially that the Treaty of Māori, we concluded, did not cede sovereignty. So that was a bit early to be saying that, but the tribunal asked for that report to be renewed and refreshed just a few years ago, just very recently. So, and then that's the death of Hongi Hika at the bottom. Hongi Hika, the great warrior rangatira. And again, just as part of this documentary that we're filming at the moment with Māori TV, we've been and actually looked at the cloak, the red cloak that Hongi Hika gave to King George IV when he went to visit him in Carlton House in London. And they forged a relationship with gift exchange and so on. So all of these images mean a lot, and they all relate to things that are inside the book. So as you're saying, Sam, it's sort of partly about the past, drawing a lot of inspiration from the things I learnt with Eruera and Armedia Sterling, my kaumātua, who I was, but also people like Bill and Connie, many years spent visiting marae and so on, but also my colleagues that I've worked with on early Māori manuscripts. We've had a big project happening on that, trying to get into the depths of the language to understand the world of the language, in the early contact period. So it's been an amazing journey, and it seems to all those strands, as you say, Sam, in a way that's about it. All the different strands of a life kind of weave together. And I guess that's sort of what's happening in this book.
Tell us about Anne, just to sort of go back to history. So I was trained in history, and I'm a boring publisher, you see, and in publishing, tell us about the relationship between the past and present. So for many, even for a historian, someone's trained in history, you'd go, I'm going to write about the past, and so back there, and we live in the present, which is up here, and the two are a long way far apart. And I think your view is there's a different relationship that is weaved between the past and the present.
Well, one of the things I think I learnt, probably learnt it first of all from Eruera Sterling. I met him when he and Amelia, his wife, and we ended up doing 2 books together, which have been reprinted recently, which is lovely, about their lives. And in Eruera's case, it was a very philosophical book, and quite political as well. It was his thoughts and reflections about our country and where it might go. And I learned from him because when I came to write my PhD, he said to me, because I spent a lot of time with him and Amelia by then, he'd started to teach me quite early on. I met him, I think, when I was 17 years old. And so he started to teach me tribal history, and I remember, great big sheets of paper on the living room floor, and Eruera dictating whakapapa to me so I could see how all the different iwi were linked up. And when we started, he said for my PhD that the marae is the university for you now. And so he suggested that I would actually spend my time as my anthropology PhD fieldwork on marae. And he said, I'll take you. So he and Amelia, and Jeremy came too, he was the photographer on many of the expeditions that we had. And I had a little blue V-dub at that time. And they would call me up and say, there's a hui on at Ahipara, or there's something on at, all these places, Waiō-Matatini, or it might have been Pariaga, and off we'd go, and we'd go to a gathering. And in the car, Eruera would often rehearse what he might, the links to this marae, what the hui was going to be about, his knowledge about those people, and how his people related to them. And then when we got there, he would always, they're quite careful about where they slept in the house, so we were looking for the right ancestor to sleep under, making sure that, you're going to have a really good sleep that night. And for, going to roughly 70 hui in about 18 months, spending a lot of time on marae, being saturated in Māori, listening to the talk right into the night, often very, very late at night, the stick being passed around the house and people telling ancient stories, I realised that ancestors are just a breath away in that world. They can just kind of almost like walk out of the wall and they're there. And I had a different view about how that the past is not a kind of, it's not something that has vacated the premises. It's very, very immediate and has a huge influence on how things work out. And the other thing I learned was from Peter Huri Nui Jones, actually, a great Tainui scholar. And he wrote about the double spiral in Māori. And he makes the point in his book about King Tawhio that is actually a representation of the cosmological chants from the old schools of learning, which people like Eruera were very expert in, and I'm sure you too, Hone, and others. That time's a spiral, that you can go right into the ancestral source, chanting, making that link with your ancestors, you're right there, right at the ancestral source, and then you can whiz right out again into the future, almost in a breath, really. So that's what I was thinking about, Sam, when I started to write this book. I thought, yeah, well, I think it's true that time is a spiral. Certainly in Te Ao Māori, it works like that. You can be in these situations and people like Eduardo had a very immediate relationship with his ancestors, and being on those marae and tūhoi and in the heart of Tainui, going on the pokai, which are the Māori Queen's gatherings, as they were then, who was the Queen at that time, I just moved into a different space-time dimension, I think, and started to see the world differently. And so I thought, well, as a writer, what to say I tried to use that idea of time as a spiral and start each chapter with something that's happened just recently in which I've usually been involved, and then just go whizzing back into the ancestral past that illuminates those events, and then make my way through and then even have reflect. It's not really so much activism, Sam, it's more reflection. It's more not telling other people what to do, but thinking as deeply as I can about the things I've learned and sharing those with other people so they can make up their own mind. It's more like that. And I think that's part of the proper role of a scholar, actually. It's not just, so to speak, give the facts or recite the narrative. It's much more to share with people the things that you're learning in the process of inquiry, and then opening up some possibilities maybe for discussion and thought, and then just seeing what happens, really.
I was going to keep in the past, but now we'll go to the present a little bit, because in the second half of the book you get right into contemporary issues that matter to lots of New Zealanders about the state of our rivers and who might own them if someone owns them, and the sea and what's going to happen to fish out there, and land and how parks and private land might be governed, and I've slightly forgotten the question, so I was thinking about all those things that you talked about.
The present, Sam.
The present.
Yeah.
Exactly.
See, I have to use
What was I going to say? I'm getting on. Yeah. No, I was going to say, so the rivers, and maybe to start with the rivers on a hot contemporary issue,
yes.
and you dive into that issue of what are the, of what we do with these rivers and how we clean them up and who's going to own them and things like that. What are the resources, sort of intellectual and ideas and stuff you get from the Pākehā world and from the Māori world to solve those issues? And how are we special in New Zealand in being able to solve those issues a little bit differently than other people?
Well, one of the things I've had a thought for quite a long time now, that in New Zealand, many non-Māori people have learnt much more than they think from Māori. There's a lot of things about Kiwis that are, very, when you spend time, as many of us do in other countries, and there's a kind of quality of humour and laughter, I think, that I miss when I'm overseas. And there's things like approaches to our relationships one with another, but also with the land and with the waterways. And I heard the Prime Minister say I had to try and compare a big anniversary for the Royal Society recently at Parliament. And the Prime Minister observed that Kiwis have an almost mystical relationship with their rivers. And I thought, I think that's very true, that this kind of connection with waterways for people that have grown up close to a particular river or a particular harbour, maybe it's a lake, could be a stream that you played in as a child. And they say the Wanganui iwi have been saying, ko au te awa ko au, kei te mate te awa, kei te mate ahau, I am the river and the river is me. The river's dying, so am I. And the interesting thing about that is it sounds like sort of poetic and metaphorical, maybe even mystical, but actually we discovered in one of our shoots recently, we went to the Waido Bar with looking at the early star navigators for one of the episodes in this documentary, and what I learnt there, which I didn't realise, was that from the ice, we had some very ancient burials there, and some of those people were not born in New Zealand, they were actually born in Polynesia. And the way the scientists can figure that out is because the isotopes that are laid down in your teeth and your bones from the water you drink as a child enables people to say with considerable degree of certainty where you were born and brought up. So I'm the river and the river is me is kind of, you could say it's poetic and beautiful, but it's also pretty actual. And, if the river is dying or the waterway is dying, so am I. And then, I recently, last year I think, I was in Havelock North talking at an arts festival just after half the town got sick. And for them it wasn't particularly metaphorical, so very actual. So I think we do have this deep connection with our waterways, but that's right and proper because they, they are, as you would say in Māori, the lifeblood of the land. They are the tears of Rangi. That's where that comes from. When in the creation story, when the sons, Tāne, separated from Rangi from Papa, forced them apart so that light could come into the world, they were heartbroken, and Rangi wept for his wife, and those are the tears of Rangi that made the streams and the rivers and the lakes, and Papa Tuanuku sent up mists to greet her lover, they're separated. So that water cycle is it's there, it's part of, we can't live without it as people, and if we degrade our waterways, it's a danger to us all and to our children and grandchildren. So trying to learn from the Wanganui River case, for example, and the chapter on waterways starts with the Wanganui, the visit that we made to Wanganui, and then the Wanganui, it's called Te Awa Tupua Act, that was passed just this year. First time in the world that a river's been recognised as a legal being with its own rights. First time in the world. Huffington Post, New York Times, it's a Guardian, it's a big international story. And again, what they're doing there, a tupua, Te Awa Tupua is what they call the river. A tupua is not actually an ancestor, and it's not really a person either. Tupua is a very ancient being from the ancestral past, and that's true of rivers. If you think we have had 80 million years of independent evolution here before people turned up. I mean, we're a kind of a 5-minute story, we're the last second really in the story at this point. So I can see in those philosophies, and I think it's great that the government actually passed that act. I think it's quite incredible really that we've made at least one big step towards saying, well, what would our country be like if we gave rivers their own rights? If we didn't see them as a resource to be exploited. We didn't suppose that somehow the world was created purely for our use as human beings, which is a real conceit when you think about it, especially in New Zealand, where we've only been here 5 minutes. And if we said, okay, they can have their own rights, so if you had a pollution tax, you might pay it to the river, for example. If you have a governance arrangement, you might learn from some of the other regimes that, for example, the public trust doctrine in the United States is really interesting, where all the waterways are in trust for the people. Nobody owns them, but they're in trust. And the state has to uphold that trust deed. It has to ensure that the scenic beauty of rivers, that their ecological health, that the plants and animals that inhabit them have rights as well. And I think that's fantastic. And they've used that particular doctrine recently in Hawaii to restore waterways that have been drained to death, basically. So these are the sorts of reflections that arise. And it's not as though what I'm not sort of thinking about so much is just purely drawing on the Māori trajectory and those philosophical ideas, but there are ideas and trajectories in the West that resonate with them, that we could bring them together. It's a little bit again like that diagram or that photograph on the back of the book. What could we do? And I think we've done a lot of it in our past history, actually. We've done a lot of that kind of weaving, actually. The treaty, I guess, was the first big attempt. But we could keep doing that, and I think it might lead us into some world-leading initiatives that would be great for everybody. That's the speculation.
Because at the start of the book, you're really strong on this fundamental ontological difference between Cook and the missionaries and others arriving, with their grids and fences and maps and not quite Outlook calendars yet, but they were about to invent them, and then Maori living in a different world, you know, and not just having a different view of that world, but living in a fundamentally different world. And maybe just to tell people a little bit about, you know, some other aspects of those different worlds, you know, one of which is that sort of relationship to the past and other ones. And then it's interesting, you know, sort of how we got from there to here, if we are a bit different now in terms of not just being these two completely different worlds.
Well, there's a big debate going on in my own discipline about the nature of cultural difference. And the debate sometimes called the ontological turn, and in fact our daughter Armedia has had quite a lot to do with it. She's a leading, she's written a very, very important and seminal book with a number of her friends about these issues. And so there's some pretty lively family debates that go into all of this as well. And I acknowledge my daughter. It's great when your kids start bringing you up, and having a daughter that is involved in my own discipline, and we collaborate and work together quite a bit. And it's like having this kind of brain transplant, really. Somebody who's absolutely brilliant but a lot younger and has a network of. She was at Cambridge and did her PhD there. So anyway, the question that this younger generation have posed is the nature of cultural difference such that there's one world and one reality and just different views of it? So we've got world views, for example. So the Maori worldview, the European worldview, etc., etc. Or could it be the case that in some deep sense, the realities differ? That if you are within Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, which is a pretty literal translation of that phrase, are you dealing with realities that work differently? And so I wanted to test the proposition, because my daughter and you know, she'd haul me off to pubs in Cambridge, and there'd be all these brilliant young graduates, and they all try and, you know, kind of educate me about these philosophical issues and test me to the nth degree. You've no idea. It was fantastic. And very, very lively and kind of quite exhausting at times, but wonderful. And so I thought, well, okay, well, you know, this is a really brilliant kind of question to pose. So I thought I'd try it out especially on the very early contact period in New Zealand, because at that point, where Europeans had just arrived and were arriving for the first time, coming on shore in the case of the chapter on the Endeavour in Tolaga Bay, but then the missionaries, because I got really fascinated with that period when missionary families came and lived ashore and had to then confront a world which they didn't run, because they definitely didn't. And if you go to places like Rangi Pa, for example, and you look down to where the missionaries had their settlement, Hungihika parked them up on this little, very barren beach, basically, where they couldn't grow their own food. They were under surveillance. And when you read their journals, you realise how hard that was for them. There was no privacy whatsoever, and they were very much dependent on the rangatira. And the same thing happened at Kerikeri with, if you go to Kororipo Pa, for example, stand up there, you can do that now because they've cleared it, and look down on the mission station, the stone store that Jeremy helped to restore, and so on. You can see that was very much a Māori world at that time. And so if you really delve deeply, read all the letters, all the journals, read what survives in Māori from that period and try and understand the relationships between these people, you can test this kind of idea. Were these different realities, or were they kind of just different views of the same world? And I got very intrigued by Thomas Kendall and Hungihika, because I think they were the two, in a way, who made the most fundamental efforts early on to test out each other's worlds. So Thomas Kendall, the missionary who came to convert the heathen, reading his letters to his wife, his journals, a lot of correspondence survives from Kendall. He's the missionary that came to, as I say, convert the heathen, but in a way became converted himself, and he started writing letters back to the Missionary Society in London, telling them that Māori philosophy was sublime, and sending them, lots and lots of Māori carvings to try and explain some of these concepts. And we have the letters, we haven't found the carvings, which is kind of tragic, because I'd love to be able to put the letters together with the carvings. And of course the as you can imagine, the Church Missionary Society was deeply unimpressed. I mean, they thought of him as someone that was definitely going under the sway of the Prince of Darkness, was the way they put it. That he was betraying his vocation as a missionary. And then when he had an affair with the tohunga's daughter at Kororipo, at Rangi Pa, then they were very sure that he was lost, and so he got kicked out of the mission. But the torment that he went through, it almost destroyed him trying to grasp Māori realities. There were no bridges built at that point. He was having to do it from scratch almost. He was the first missionary to really delve into the language, for example, to learn the chants, to really try and understand that world. And Hongi Hika had become his kind of protector of the other missionaries. And Hongi went on the opposite journey, in a way. And so he was using the missionaries in many ways, but he was also intensely curious about them. And he made this amazing expedition to Britain with Thomas Kendall in 1820. And Kendall went as his guide. And they went to Cambridge and they worked with Professor Lee, so there's the link with Cambridge again. And Professor Lee wrote a very fine grammar of Māori, actually, for the fact it was the first one. It was really terrific, and I trained originally as a linguist, and I've read the grammar. It's really good. And then they were fated. Hongi and Waikato were fated by British society, and they were, taken to meet all the aristocrats and the bishops, and then finally introduced to the king. But for Hongi and in particular, it was in a way he was a kind of a Māori patriot, I think you would say. He decided his own ways of being were better. He preferred them, and he couldn't. And so I've got there's debates where he's debating with the missionaries, and we have transcripts of these debates, which is great. And so we know how they spoke with each other with a lot of respect. You've got to say, it's interesting. So that's what I was doing with these different realities. And then Marsden, of course, is the other. Marsden's a different kind of character. Marsden was a fantastic and curious inquirer into Māori life, but he never doubted the virtue of his own. Never. So he was, totally certain that, everything that he believed in was absolutely right. And Māori were very intelligent, he thought, very impressive. He held them in very high esteem, but basically wrong about a lot of fundamental things. And so you can see these realities actually clashing, and episode after episode. And rather than explore these things philosophically in the abstract, I thought it was much better just basically tell the stories from the point of view of the people that were closest, who lived them, and then let readers make up their own minds about whether these were the same reality with different views or different realities. And certainly at times, I think, for people like Marsden as well, Māori realities were quite incomprehensible, unintelligible really, and vice versa. And so after, all this time, what we don't realise is how many bridges we have all been building over the last, couple of 100 years to try and make some sort of sense of each other. But at that time, they didn't have that, and it was just like this war, and how that led into the treaty and so on.
That's great. I'm going to whip to the present again, because I figure we're going past the present, flipping back and forth. I'm trying to get into that now, you see. So in the chapter on the sea, which is really great, on one of the things I love about it is there's an image at the start of Maori going out and meeting Cook and challenging him and stuff like that, and then we have the Petrobras miners coming in, and again Maori going out and then challenging them again and saying, hey, you can't come here, which is a wonderful just sort of past and present meeting like that. But the other thing you have in there is you have a thing about you say can different worlds converge, and it's about something about New Zealanders' love of the sea, and as you were saying about rivers, and also about tall poppy syndrome actually being a potentially bicultural invention, which was new to me and interesting, I thought. And then you actually get into two, controversial things over the last few years. One, the foreshore and seabed and foreshore and seabed, and act, and then the Kermadec sanctuary, and in both of them, I think, your view of what's going on between Maori and Pa, the Crown, lots of stuff is pretty interesting. Maybe you tell us what you make of those.
Oh, well, okay, so the chapter on the sea, because of course I grew up in Gisborne, so, like so many Kiwis, I got a really close, and here we are in Devonport, and we've got the Navy just down the road, and I'm sort of strong relationships with the Navy as well. But also with voyaging waka, the waka star navigators of today, are people that I've sort of spent a bit of time with as well. So the sea is immense. That's the thing that really astounds me when I think about New Zealand. Here we are at the heart of the world's largest ocean, and that this was the hardest place on the planet, basically, of any size to get to in the time of sail. And so the fact that these star navigators managed to invent the technologies and the kind of strategies which enabled them to once they got into Central and East Polynesia very, very rapidly, go right up to Hawaii, go to Easter Island, and we think almost certainly to the west coast of South America, come down here to Aotearoa, and going to some of those voyaging sites. I mean, we are a seafaring people, and then the fact that the Europeans came also with Cook and Tasman, and I've, as many of you will know, I've spent a lot of time writing about various voyages, and Bligh and Cook, and spent a lot of time sort of imaginatively with these explorers as well. And they had to face similar challenges in some ways of being able to make very long voyages, to have the craft that were flexible and strong enough to not to let them go into that vast ocean and never be seen again, but also to be able to navigate. And the differences between star navigation, for example, and the kind of navigation that Cook was doing, I've been fascinated by both traditions of navigation and tried to compare and understand them. Essentially, the thing that's interesting about that, and it comes back to our two realities in a way, is that in star navigation, the navigator is the key instrument on board. So the star navigator is somebody that in that tradition has been schooled. And in the old days, they learned long, long lists of islands with the names of the island, who's the chief of the island, what are the main resources on that island, the key bearings to get from one island to the next. So it's a relational system of navigation. So you set out from one particular point on the land, you've got the bearing to go to your destination, but you've also got the succession of stars that will rise, during the night on that to take you safely to where you want to go. So they call that the star path. So it comes up and the star will come up and the name star will, as soon as it gets a bit too high in the sky, you pick up the next one and the next one till you actually reach your destination. That's how that works. But the navigator is the key. They're looking out for they're sensing the winds, they're feeling in their body the swell slapping against the hull of the canoe, and they've memorised all this information. And they don't sleep much because they're watching. And today, a lot of people there's a number of people now sailing like that again, and they're wonderful people. And had the privilege of going out on a voyaging waka with Jack Thatcher just lately. That was really cool. And talking to Jack about how he's trained as a star navigator. So that whole tradition is alive and kicking. And with Cook, just realising how, as somebody that had been brought up in the coal trade, and he was a great coastal sailor, but he was also at the forefront of these hydrography of charting and navigation, the gridding of the sea, and the use of instruments to be able to do that more and more reliably. So we all know the story of Harrison's chronometer and so on. So I've studied all of that, and these are very different relationships with the ocean. If you're a star navigator, your relationship with the ocean is that the ancestors are actually part of your technology, you might say. So the stars are ancestors, the winds are ancestors. There are people like ancestors like Paikea that come and, the voyaging, the whale rider, that whole story. They come and help you on your journeys. With Cook and with the European navigators, it was mediated through instruments and through mathematics and through computation. And the sea became abstract. If you look at the charts, the sea is empty in a way. It's sort of It's two-dimensional. The grid is there, the latitude, the longitude. And we have a relationship with the ocean through that kind of system, which is in a way quite impersonal. And in a way, the ocean's an object, or we're the seeing subject, you might say. The eye of God approach that you see in these particular charts is really, really interesting. So anyway, in the book, in that chapter, what I'm doing is I'm looking at, as you say, starting off with whānau Apanui, of course, because that's Erueta Sterling was from Te Whānau Apanui. And so that's quite, know those people pretty well. And when the Petrobras oil drilling, they were doing exploration for, they had a license from the government, and Whānau Apanui had not been asked, and they objected to having this ship drilling for Petrobras in their waters. And so they went out and defied it, and went out, and of course Elvis Teddy was arrested, and I tell all these stories in there about how all that played out. And link it to Erueta talking to me about his own love of the sea, and how people related to the sea when he was a boy. Very personal again. His mother was the high chieftainess, Ariki Line, in Whānau Apanui. So she was the one that they would take the first fish to. And he was asked to do that when he was a boy, with the moki, which is a sacred fish. And part of the reason Whānau Apanui was so upset with Petrobras is that they were drilling right where the moki comes. And when the moki comes, it's about the fertility of the ocean. And you interfere with that at your peril. And so it's these stories. So when you come to the foreshore and seabed, what's really interesting about this is our daughter Armedia at the moment. She's actually done a lot of work in Scotland as well as in New Zealand, in Te Ao Māori, and she's come up with a whole lot of stuff about the foreshore and seabed in Scotland, including on the island of Ulva, where a number of my ancestors came from. And of course the crofters there actually had these huge disputes with the government over the foreshore and seabed. It's really ironic. You read the disputes back then between the Scottish crofters and their lairds and the government, and boy, it sounds like a replay of the foreshore and seabed in New Zealand. So there's nothing new under the sun in a way. But what I'm trying to do is not judge, but to understand and let other people see how this works out and how people felt when, I was heartbroken when Helen Clark, who I know well and respected, called the people on the hikoi haters and wreckers, because I had a lot of friends on that hikoi and they were anything but. This gaps of comprehension and empathy still after so many years. And so in a way in the book I'm trying to build some more bridges and hopefully to let people learn about the other side of some of these stories, but also understand more deeply what where the positions that the government has taken might come from in our own legal history, for example. It's really, really interesting seeing where some of our legal conceptions about property and about the EEZ, where they actually come from as well. So that's what that one's about. And it's not a very long chapter, and I think it's quite an easy read. You might not think it, but it's, I'm trying to make the book, and people are telling me they find it really easy to read, which is great, because some of the ideas it might sound as though it's going to be incredibly esoteric, but I don't think it is.
That's a great answer, and I thought you were going to avoid this foreshore and seabed actually, but you got right into it. And I was just rereading the end of the book today, and it's very readable. And as you say, because it's done through stories rather than through abstractions, and that's a marvellous thing. And I think at this point, I'm going to throw it open to the audience for a little bit for some questions, John. Is that good?
Do you have one, John? Do you have a question? Let John ask a question.
Well, tēnā koe. E te mi mai tātou. I tēnei kōrero e te wairua, e te Māori. The things you've spoken about tonight, man, I live that. The wairua. In 21st century Devonport, in the city of sails, I still feel those things, because I grew up on the water, the top end of the kaupara, up in a place called Nomai. And that's between Dargaville and Ruai, up that end of the kaupara. And we call that Taraki o Te Wairong. So it's an extension of the kaupara. We get to a place called Ruawai, the two waters. And the spiritual feeling when you get to a place called Ruawai, it has a huge impact on our growth. And what you're talking about tonight, I can feel it all, I can hear it all, I can see it all, I can see them. Whenever I go back to my marae in a place called Nomai, it's about to honour them. And what you're talking about in your book, an extension of this, I've got a question actually, a part A, for the front cover. You know, the notorious chieftain back in the day was Hongi Hika. In our Ngāpui world, in our Ngāti Whātua world, we feared him because he was such a notorious warrior. Didn't care much about what iwi or hapu you belonged to until he arrived. And if it didn't suit his discussion pattern, some people might say, then you were toast. And Damien, I just want to ask you this question about your cover. In selecting the Hone Hika to be part of your cover story, what was your vision for that? You did try to explain it. I never got it because I feel when we, even now today, in a place called, we call it Kaikohe, but its real name is Kaikohe. The people still revere him and talk about all the other chiefs that came down from the north to visit other tribes around the country. Let's put it that way. Let's put it that way, to visit other people and see what they had in their garden. And if it didn't suit, they said, oh well, for you not growing the right type of puha, which I'm used to, I'll take that, and her. And that was the compensation. So, and my question to you is selecting the cover of Hongi, because I find that fascinating for me. In Waitangi at the moment, I go up there on a weekly basis. My eldest son Daniel, who is harvesting the forest up there just above the golf course, logging that forest. We talk to it before we do anything, every day, every night. So that's the feeling I get from the Tears of Rangi. Just the title alerts me to, gee, we are sharing this in another way, and it's so good. So I asked that question of you, David.
I'll try and respond. I'm remembering the stories that Eruera used to tell me about when those warriors came down the coast, because you're exactly right. You know, Ngāti Porou, I'm from Ngāti Porou and from whānau Apanui, I suppose, and some of my closest relationships. And the stories about Hongi and the others that came down the coast are stories that were vividly remembered and spoken about. And Koro used to tell me the story about, for example, the attack on Whetū Matarau Pa. And he told me the story, and I realised at this point that his attitude towards some of these things was a bit different than I expected. And he was telling me the story about the attack by these warriors from the north on Whetū Matarau, which is in his own territory. And they saw these guys with these big kind of, sticks. And according to, and they were shooting them in the air, like this Koro was saying. And he said they thought they had these patete guns. They're what they call whamamaku guns made out of patete, and it's a wood that you you take the core out, and the kids used to play with them, and they were pop guns. You put dried kumara in them, and you use them as pop guns. And so they thought they were, for some bizarre reason, had come down with all these whamamaku guns. So the Ngāti Porou warriors stood up on the ramparts of Whetu Matarau Pa and called out to them, to these northern warriors, "Ene whamamaku ki ena, ene whamamaku ki ena, these whamamaku guns, our whamamaku guns to yours." And then they turned around and did the whakapohane there, the classic insult, standing up on the ramparts of their pa. And of course, as Koro told me, all these warriors had their guns all primed, they went like that. Some of those guys never made that joke again. So he thought that was hysterically funny, that story, even though... I think, when I think about Hongi Hika, when you delve into the stories about Hongi and what happened to him as a boy, when his sister was killed and the things that happened to his whānau, you read the stories of Māori, you try and do your best to time travel back into that era, which is incredibly difficult, it's probably impossible, but you do your best. Talking with people like, some of my colleagues in Māori studies, Hone Sadler, for example, has been fantastic to talk to about this stuff. And Hongi was somebody that, this whole idea that when the mana of your own people has been degraded and desecrated, as it certainly was when he was a very young warrior. I mean, the things that happened to his sister were pretty terrible. And you had to then try and redress the balance. Otherwise, the mana of your own whānau and your own kin group is forever lost and degraded. And that means you can't really function in the world in that kind of way of being. And so that drive to try and redress the balance. But the problem was when muskets came, and Hongi, because of his relationship with the missionaries, got some of the first armaments, then the balance was basically totally disrupted because some people had guns and other people didn't. And so when they went off on these taua, then what kept on happening was that, lots and lots of people would get killed on one side and not many on the other, which was not the way it had been in the past. Usually warfare was quite... When you look at the way people fought in the early days without muskets, it was quite limited in many ways and not that many people got killed. But once you had guns, that changed. So trying to delve into that world, and Hongi, it's interesting. I mean, Kendall, I really felt for Kendall, and I also really felt for Hongi. I think that they were both dealing with extraordinary times, and I don't know how human beings, they both sincerely tried to kind of grapple with each other's worlds, I think, and to try and make sense and build relationships. And it didn't always work, but that's the way life is. And so that's why he's there, because I think in that period, he was he was a really major player, not just in the north, as we all know. So does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Sure, tough question.
It's a good one, Mike.
Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Damien, you mentioned, if I heard correctly, that you believe that the Maori reached South America. Now, what led you to believe that, or were you referring to the Polynesians as a whole and the sweet potato?
Yeah. No, I'm talking about the ancestors of Māori, of course, because what appears to have happened, and there's a whole bunch of my colleagues that have been working on these things, very, very actively using things like lithic sourcing, where you can trace stones back to the quarries that they were, so stone tools, for example. You can figure out by lithic sourcing, looking at the chemical composition of the stone, where it came from. DNA tracking, not just the people, but also the animals that travelled with the ancestors of Māori, so the Polynesian pigs, the Polynesian chicken, the kiore, the Polynesian rat. And there's a huge amount of research, and also the linguistic trajectories. The research that they've got Polynesian chicken in Chile. So they've got bones of Polynesian chickens in Chile and archaeological digs. One of my colleagues, some of you may have heard of Lisa Matioso-Smith, who's done a lot of amazing work of this kind. She's a fantastic physical anthropologist. She calls herself a molecular anthropologist. I think she is very firmly convinced that people made that jump from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island to the west coast of South America, and I think she thinks she's potentially got human traces too. But so I didn't say for certain, but it's looking very, very likely. And when you go back in as I've done when I was working in Tahiti and writing a lot about the Tahitian navigators, they were really good. Hopping across to South America would have been a logical step, I think. They exploded once they got those very fast, flexible voyaging canoes and the capacity to sail by the stars. Going to South America would not have been a big... And talking to the contemporary star navigators too. We have this kind of famous Goldie painting of the emaciated human wreckage, floating up and clawing its way. The one of the arrival of the Maori with all the people, their bones showing and stuff. And you show that to one of those star navigators today, and they just laugh. They say, "Well, it's about a 10-day hop. It's not that bad, and they've done it plenty of times." So, so I think for them, the sea was kind of a very familiar place, and still is for many of these contemporary navigators. And they're very good at getting their way around.
Kia ora. Can I just tell you another story?
Yes, please.
I'm a professional kumara grower. I'm a market gardener from the Ruai area, no mine. Back in 1962, the local auctioneers, Arthur Coleman, from Turnerton Growers, we did a thesis on the migration of the kumara, and they traced it right back to the place you were talking about. Back to South America. But the variation in the migration of the kumara from South America, the variation changed on the Great Migration, of course, and then where they called into different islands and changed. But I'll tell another story. In 1964, the Auckland housewife, we used to send the kumara to Auckland, and the Auckland housewife complained that the kumaras we were growing were too big. So we cross-pollinated them. And took the strain of what we call the Owairaka red of the kumara and give it today's colouring. So the kumara you're buying in the supermarket, we were responsible for changing it.
Congratulations, because that's something I enjoy.
We kept the taste, of course. Thank you.
And you sort of touched on a point, I think, that's very relevant to sort of New Zealand and Devonport, where you basically said that the Kiwis generally are absorbing that love of the environment and the sea, which has always been. And I'm very interested in genealogy, and I've been back to Britain and Kent, where the gravestones disappear in 1600s. You know that's where your people came from, your Te Ranga Waiwai sort of concept. And I'm just wondering what we're talking about is sort of you say in Britain you had your tribal societies there 2,000 years ago, and then the Romans arrived. And so whether you might say the situation, the evolution in Britain is and New Zealand is a matter of philosophical time and distance, that sort of in say 1,000 years we might be in a similar position that Britain is, with a complete intermingling.
Well, one of the things that really fascinates me is the way in which, I've been because of my friendships and this long times that I've spent on marae, I've been fascinated by whakapapa for a long time. So it's not really genealogy exactly, it's kind of a relational view of how the world works, exactly. So it's not just amongst people, whakapapa. So you can have, for example, in a whakapapa, you can have, it starts off with a great surge of energy. and then you get memory and thought and desire emerge actually before you get any. Then the stars and the moon come later, and then Rangi and Pa, and then all the children of Rangi and Pa, and that's when you start getting the birds and the fish and the plants and people. So they're all in a way in this kind of idea about how the world emerged. They're all kinfolk, and this makes a big difference to the way you relate to, for example, a river or the bush, or that you don't see them as resources or as objects or as something where extraction is the primary aim. You see them as another form of life that if you respect and kind of, make sure that your exchanges with them are balanced, then you'll both prosper. But if you just only take, then the chances are that relationship will collapse. And I think we're seeing this. We're seeing collapsing ecosystems. And we know that. I mean, anybody that studies biodiversity, and I spend a lot of time with environmental scientists as well. So whakapapa is actually very like complex systems theory. This is the thing. What's really interesting to me is part of where you were heading maybe was to say, well, we used to have tribal societies in Europe, 2,000 years ago. Well, actually, my ancestors were still pretty tribal on Ulva when they came here. I have to say, they spoke Gaelic, and they were it was very interesting getting to know more about what my ancestors were like when they came to New Zealand. And remember, they were in the same historic era, It's probably one of the reasons why my ancestor James MacDonald actually had a big affinity. He had a great, he learned to speak Māori. He was a very fine carver. I think he felt his clannish kind of thing just resonated, and he got on really, really well with people. What interests me more is to think that in Māori philosophy there are kind of ways of thinking which make it much easier to think about how these very complex array of phenomena in the world are linked and how exchanges happen between them. So I'm at the moment one of the vice presidents of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and I think we have a huge problem in the scientific paradigm of fragmented forms of knowledge, where we've partitioned and siloed the sciences in many ways. We've separated people from the environment. So we've got the social sciences and the natural sciences. We've got all these different sciences where, I try to understand how rivers work. So to do that, I've got to go and talk to a geologist, a geomorphologist, a hydrologist, freshwater ecologist, a botanist. By the time I've got to the end of where I want to go and understanding how a river works, I probably talk to about 20 different scientists, and they usually don't talk to each other. And so if you're wanting to restore a river to health, you really need to understand probably all of these dynamics, and not only that, how they link up with each other. And I think we're seeing that in climate science. If you try and talk about the climate in a way where the climate scientists, who never have really tried to understand people because the social sciences are parked off in a separate domain, and then when those conversations don't really work to get the desired effect, are the scientific paradigms and structures themselves non-adaptive? Are they non-adaptive? I think they probably are. So I'm sort of arguing, not so much in this book, but with my colleagues in the Royal Society, and I'm saying to them, look, mind versus matter is being exploded by brain science. Subject versus object is being exploded by quantum physics. People versus environment is a nonsense in terms of all of the environmental sciences. And subject, when you're thinking about these Cartesian divisions that we build our scientific structures on, they're based on dead science. And so whakapapa, on the other hand, it's very like complex systems theory. It's all about, and it's much easier to think about very complex relationships between things and how they interact and the exchanges and the energy. It's quite easy to actually make that jump if you learn to think in a paradigm like that. So those are the kinds of things that fascinate me. It's not to say that, once we were all, tribesmen and our ancestors daubing themselves with woad, and now we're all civilised and doing, marvellously well. Well, we look at the planet at the moment, and possibly that's not, our old ideas about progress probably have to be rethought. And we need new paradigms, we need new ways of thinking. And the more we experiment at the moment, the better. And I think in New Zealand we could be right at the cutting edge of that, right in the forefront. And I think in many ways we are. I think many of our scientists are crossing over these edges, and they're working quite closely with Maori thinkers about all sorts of things now. It's fascinating to watch. So that's kind of where I go on that one. I think that's why I like the spiral of time. The arrow of time goes like that. You start off from one point. This is the modernist theory of time. Here's your ancestors. You fire the arrow off into the future. They're left behind. We're off into some kind of great progress. But the spiral enables you to go back and take inspiration from the past and learn from it, as well as take that energy and hope and optimism out into the future. So I think we are well placed, to do some really, really interesting things, and I think a lot of the younger generation of scientists especially are doing them. And we didn't even talk about gender. I got a whole chapter on that. Hey, Jacinda.
Should we take one more question? Can you do one more?
Just last one. Yeah,
Last
we're
one.
going to wind up. Yeah.
Or maybe down the back, Jan, what do you think?
Fair enough.
Nā mihi ki a koe mō tō kōrero I tēnei pō. Thank you. I just want to look at perhaps a little bit of an expansion on that regaining knowledge from Mātauranga and blending that with Western science. And when you talk about the fact that the scientists that you talk to don't talk to each other, they're also not talking to Mātauranga experts either. And I've been in this situation with someone with vast knowledge of coding and the importance of that, and having a Western scientist sort of say, thank you, you've said all I need to say. And that's the brilliant thing. Have you got any thoughts on that area about getting Western science to actually understand that Indigenous science is real and has a real potent part to play in healing our earth?
Okay, well, the interesting thing is that the Royal Society just had its 150th anniversary, the Royal Society of New Zealand, which of course was descended from the Royal Society of London that sent out the Endeavour to New Zealand. So we're one of the maybe the only nation state whose shared history began with a scientific expedition. And right from the beginning, if you go back to the history of the New Zealand Institute, which was the founding, was the original institution of scientists in New Zealand. When you look at all the members of the Royal Society or the New Zealand Institute, most of those people were very deeply immersed in Māori. They had worked alongside, so Colenso was writing about botany all the time, and he was, he was a missionary, but he was a botanist, and he was talking to Hooker and people like that. He was sending specimens over to Kew, and he had worked very, very intimately and closely with, he was a fluent Māori speaker, of course, and you look at the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, full of stuff on Māori topics. So early on, in that early period of engagement, there was a huge amount of interchange between these knowledge systems. And some very interesting things came out of that. I mean, it's intriguing when you think of the colonial history of the history of relationships between Māori and Pākehā New Zealand, and you think of Australia, or you think of Canada, or you think of the States. The trajectory has been somewhat different, I think. And a lot of that is to do with the knowledge exchanges that went on and have always gone on. Because right from the outset, you get people like Marsden saying, these people are brilliant, they're incredibly intelligent. He was being hauled off into marae and interrogated, about all sorts of philosophical issues, and he was deeply impressed, and he wasn't an easy person to impress, old Marsden. Samuel Marsden was a tough guy, the flogging parson, he wasn't a bleeding heart of any description whatsoever. So I think it's been happening for a long time, actually. And I think maybe it didn't really stop until about the 30s. It came into a flowering with Apirana Ngata and with Peter Buck, and there was a whole period when people like Api he had a very close relationship with Horace Belshaw, the first professor of economics, with Sir John Salmond, who's a kind of relative of Jeremy's, who was the Speaker of the House and the great jurisprudence, writer about jurisprudence. But the intellectual exchanges were very, very vital right up until about the 30s. And then for a while they stopped, and they stopped in the Royal Society as well, and people almost forgot that they'd happened. And so what I'm seeing happening now is I think it's a resurgence of something which we had forgotten. But I think there are many scientists who don't talk to experts in mātauranga, but increasingly there are many who do. And they come up with some really interesting science. It's fascinating, actually. I've been, I get to see these things. I'm sitting on grant panels and the proposals and the work that's going on. Often it's seen as world leading. And I think this, so for example, at the moment we're proposing some work on rivers, and it's going to go to the top congress on science, on river science in Lyon next year. And everybody's fascinated, It's so I think in New Zealand we've got huge opportunities, and it's we're a small, intimate society. We're really rich in the different legacies that we've brought with us. I think they can talk with each other much more readily than we sometimes suppose. I didn't even talk about how women came to get the vote first in the world in New Zealand and what Māori women might have had to do with that and so on. I think these conversations can be difficult at times, but they can also be incredibly fertile, is my point. They can be very creative. And I guess that's where I just like to leave it, this conversation, with that optimism, that sense of hope, that we won't waste the chances that we've got, that we will keep on experimenting, and we'll keep on being bold, and we might engender new thoughts of global importance out of those conversations. That's my hope.
And before handing over to Hone, who's going to close things out, or actually pre-close things out, yes, is to say Rachel from Paradox Books is over there, and a very optimistic author, has written a very optimistic book, and I'd encourage you to go and buy it. And just to thank Anne for doing this tonight, and to thank Hone for introducing us.
Tēnā koe, everyone. Look, we come to the part of the evening where we are all together are going to bless this book. And in it, to revere the intelligence it holds for all of us. And as we heard in the question time tonight, the reverence for the world to understand and to learn from a little place called New Zealand. And may we encourage you, Dame, to keep going in all your appointments and all your authorities and all your ability to communicate with the world. And as you so rightly say, on our behalf, the least we can say to you, kia kaha, kia mai, kia manonui. E tū e te kōrero, e tū e te tupuna, e tū ki te whaiau, ki te aomarama, e te rangi, e te tangi, o te puka, o Rangi's tears. Ladies and gentlemen, can we all stand, because I'd like us all to give blessing to this book.